We're talking about Aristotle's doctrine of the soul. A word of caution here. What Aristotle means by the soul isn't necessarily what we mean by the word today. In most modern religions, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, to name just the major ones, the soul is commonly imagined as an immaterial something that rides around in the body but is capable of existing on its own, in a purely spiritual state, perhaps awaiting reunification with the old body, or perhaps awaiting transfer into a new one. Oddly, that kind of view is in some ways closer to Democritus than to Aristotle, in that it pictures the body as a kind of machine. What Aristotle means by a soul is more intimately bound up with matter. Rather than riding around in a body, the soul is the body's organizing principle. It's what guarantees that the body belongs to a definite species, like mackerel. I'm not saying that the religious view of the soul and Aristotle's concept of it can't be brought together. I'm just saying that Aristotle's way of thinking about the soul is only one of several possible ways, and we need to keep this fact in mind. Aristotle's doctrine of the soul is probably the single most important ingredient in his overall philosophy. Understanding what Aristotle thinks about the soul will ultimately help us get a handle on how the world looked to the thinkers of ancient times, and that, in turn, will help us see more clearly the problems posed by our way of thinking. All this will take time to develop, so be patient if it looks to you as though I've wandered off the main point. I haven't. Even so, it's time we got clear on the appeal for Aristotle of thinking about living beings the way he did. What's the payoff for a scientist, as Aristotle was, of positing that a fish consists of matter on the one hand and a soul on the other? I've already said that Aristotle's view doesn't really pan out. What I want to do now, though, is convince you that the view could look promising to someone who doesn't have the benefit of 20 centuries of hindsight the way we do. Here's the answer in a nutshell. Aristotle thinks that this matter-soul scheme is the basis for a scientific explanation of how a fish comes into existence and lives out its life. When we consider the growth of a living organism and look for the key ingredient that makes all the parts develop the way they're supposed to, we think about DNA. But the idea of DNA would have been a huge leap for Aristotle, and for Democritus too. Instead, Aristotle hypothesized that, in effect, the tiny bit of matter that any living thing starts out as already has attached to it a sort of blueprint for the complete growth pattern from youth to adulthood. That's the soul. It's a sort of image of the future that draws the organism along its growth curve, if you will, as though the organism had this blueprint in view and was striving to actualize it. This blueprint, the soul, is also the thing that guides the organism through its routine activities, like eating and procreating. I'm guessing that this still sounds sort of foreign to you. We don't easily think like this. When we think of birth and growth, we think of strands of genetic material twisting around and clicking into place, and we think of cell division and all that. In short, we think that the real action is going on at the microscopic level, and that each component does its thing blindly, without any view of what the other parts are doing and without any view of the future. Aristotle is coming at the same topic from a very different direction. So, let me say a couple of things to help you get the hang of Aristotle's approach. First, let's think macro instead of micro. It's true that we have learned to say a lot of significant stuff about what goes on at the micro level. We know, for instance, that such and such a gene on such and such a location will cause a human fetus to develop into a person with blue eyes. This is sometimes called bottom-up causation. Things happening at the microscopic level have macroscopic effects. But on the other hand, we don't fully understand the workings of a living body if we only think in the one direction, micro to macro. For a complete picture, we also need to think the other way, macro to micro. We need to notice, for instance, that the pumping of the heart and the movement of air through the lungs maintains a certain balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. So one thing we want to understand about Aristotle is that even if he hasn't got the complete picture, he does have a good firm grip on part of it that we sometimes forget, namely top-down causation. The ability of a living body considered as a total system to regulate the workings of its parts, right down to the molecular level. Second, let's think about goal-directed behavior. One way Aristotle describes the relation of matter and soul in a living organism is that the soul represents the purpose of the organism, the condition or activity that it's trying to actualize. Nowadays, this kind of talk about the purpose of an organism, or even of an organ, makes scientists a little nervous. It sounds too much like intention or design. However, we do sometimes talk about matter striving to do this or that. Your chemistry teacher, explaining the behavior of ions, charged atoms, probably talked about an ion which wanted to, quote unquote, get rid of an electron, or was trying to fill its outer shell by adding an electron. Even when we're not using language like that, in physics, we often speak of an object having a natural tendency to move in a direction that will transform its potential energy into kinetic energy. How far is that, really, from Aristotle's willingness to speak about matter having a natural tendency to actualize its potential as a living organism? I hope I've given you the sense that Aristotle wasn't completely off base. To think in terms of a living organism as a unitary thing whose growth and continued existence is based on top-down causation. I hope I've also convinced you that he wasn't completely off base to talk about physical processes in terms of some potential condition which the matter is trying to actualize. Where we part company with Aristotle, I think, is over his willingness to combine these two modes of analysis, to speak of the future state of a living being, such as the adult form that a newly born or hatched or germinated organism will eventually grow into, as a causal agent that acts top-down, macro to micro, and at the same time acts as a goal which the thing is striving to reach. Like I say, we don't think that way, but the ingredients for that way of thinking are more familiar than we might realize at first sight.